Hello. Welcome to Wild Geese. I have some devastating news. I have to retire my theme music and find new theme music. It is very sad news and also very happy news at the same time. I have to do this because I got into the YouTube creator program. Yay! Which means that I can monetize my videos now. But YouTube apparently has this little rule that even if you have the license to music, it needs to be a license that you got through YouTube in order to not get a copyright claim every time you post that song. So all of the videos that I've posted so far with that song have gotten a copyright claim, and then I have to go in and dispute it and give them the license, and it can take up to 30 days for them to process that. And I can't keep doing that. So we're going to have to find new music. I was going to try to do that before this episode came out, but I don't want to rush it. I don't want to pick something that I don't really like just because I want it to be out right now. So this is a musicless episode. But in better news, we have Poppy with us here today. She's a dog. She's not my dog, but I'm dog sitting. We're dog sitting, me and my roommates. This is Poppy. She's so beautiful and wonderful. We hope that she says hi. Okay, no. Today I want to talk about how men and women need to approach spirituality and transcendence differently. This is going to be a conversation that talks a lot about the masculine and the feminine and blah, blah, blah. And I cringe at those terms too. Before you run away thinking that this is going to be like a trad wife conversation or like a goop woo-woo self-help thing, please stick with me. I'm not here to indoctrinate you into a cult. At the base of this conversation, what I want to talk about is how men move from unenlightened to enlightened, or from profane to sacred, from losing themselves, from learning lessons of compassion and empathy and forgiveness, while women make that transition from the other side of the spectrum by claiming themselves, by gaining a sense of ego. And I think a lot of prevailing spiritual advice, whether you're coming at this from like a new agey spiritual, like I'm just spiritual, not religious type of thing, or you're coming from a very staunch religious background, I think a lot of the spiritual advice that we get is actually aimed towards men and what men actually need to feel those transcendent states. And I kind of cringe a little bit at the idea of even putting an episode out there that has anything to do with the divine masculine and divine feminine. I think when I hear those words, I kind of immediately bristle at it and start to think, is this going to be like a trad wife conversation telling me to like be more submissive in order to gain my divine femininity? Like, I don't know how I feel about that. And I know that we all bring a lot of baggage to conversations around spirituality. I really hesitated to do this episode, but y'all voted for it in the Instagram poll. By the way, if you don't follow Wild Geese Pod on Instagram, that's where the next episode topic comes from. I usually throw out a couple of options and let y'all vote on it. So you guys voted for this episode. So I'm nervous to do it, but I'm going to do it. I think a good way to start out this episode is just making it very clear the standpoint that I come from in this whole conversation and my relationship to spirituality. Hey, girl.
Hey.
So before I go deeper into what you might call the divine feminine and how we as women need to approach spirituality differently than men, I want to give you some context into my relationship with wellness, spirituality, and all of that, because if I were you, I would be skeptical. I am a white woman talking about this stuff. You should be skeptical of me in this conversation, and here's why. Back in college, I listened pretty routinely to a podcast that I will not name because I don't want to get sued. Not that they would care, whatever. But I listened pretty routinely to this podcast, and it was two women. It was a wellnessy, spirituality, new agey podcast, and it got me into meditation and ideas of manifestation and, you know, all of that stuff that can feel really fun and exciting to dig into. And it was fun and exciting. But it also, when I think back to that time in my life, I was getting very, very lost in all of it, especially with conversations around like manifestation and that sort of like new agey spirituality. Anytime something would go wrong in my life, I then was like,
well, I didn't do enough like obsessive mind rituals about it, and it's my fault that I didn't get that thing that I wanted.
And it ended up being like very kind of self-destructive. And a lot of their conversations, I feel like, were very much about like transcendence and about how, if you meditate for long enough or you do enough ayahuasca, you'll find yourself, but you'll find like this insane otherworldly thing. It was all about transcending this world in a way, which made me feel very disconnected from the ground under my feet. And I don't think I really realized that until I gained some distance from it. And the only reason I gained some distance from it is because in 2020, the hosts very sneakily started to slip in some QAnon talking points. And I am lucky to have enough critical thinking on my own, but also have enough people in my life that I love and that I talk to that have critical thinking as well, that I was able to spot the QAnon talking points. And I went over to a different podcast called Conspirituality, which I don't know if it's still around or not. If it is, you should go listen to it. I haven't really listened to it since 2020, so don't take my word for it. I don't know what they're doing now, but what they were doing then was taking concepts and leaders in the New Agey wellness world and showing you how they were leading people down the alt-right pipeline with conspiratorial thinking. And I was disgusted by basically the entire industry and turned away from spirituality entirely after that. For a while, I would still meditate here and there, but anytime anyone brought up anything New Agey, I had a huge side eye at them. So it's been interesting the last couple of years trying to find a version of spirituality that doesn't feel like it's just repackaged white supremacy and eugenics and conspiratorial thinking. So when we approach this topic as you're listening, and as you're listening to anyone that's saying anything that has to do with spirituality, your spidey senses need to go up. Your discernment needs to be at an all-time high. And I just think that that's an extremely important disclaimer to make in this conversation. But given all of that context, you might be wondering, okay, why are we talking about this now then? And the thing that kind of sent me down this rabbit hole was I saw a TikTok video, of course, of a woman talking about how one of her biggest regrets is putting so much onus on the spiritual teachings of men. And it's not because she hates men or something. It's just the experience that she has observed in so many of the other women in her life are that a lot of that advice just didn't apply to them, that it was so much about losing yourself and your ego, and so many women don't even have an ego to lose. When I reflect on this, I think of one of the most prevalent compliments that mothers receive are how selfless they are. And of course, nobody wants to be qualified as selfish, but also, if I turn that word over in my head over and over again, it doesn't sound like a compliment. Selfless? She doesn't have a self? And that's supposed to be like the thing to strive for. And when I heard this woman talking about this, I was like, oh, this is ringing true to me, because in the last couple of years, from 2020, what I was talking about a second ago, to now, I think that recently I've become a lot more interested in building up a self-concept and becoming interested in my own interests. Like, you can see that in a lot of the content that I'm making, and it feels like a more spiritually fulfilling journey for me than any of that new agey lose yourself spirituality did back in 2020, when I was really consciously trying to connect to something bigger than me through teachings that for the most part have like a very masculine origin. I was actually losing my sense of groundedness in many aspects of life. I would meditate, and the whole time that I was laying there meditating, I was like hoping for some like divine experience where I hear this outside voice that comes in and tells me what to do next, or I like see an angel or something. And look, if that is what you are looking for, if that is what you have found, if that is what you are hoping for, I am not here to kill any of that for you. All I am saying is that in my own experience, in the past couple of years, as I've tried to root deeper into myself and build up a level of self-trust and self-respect, I feel more closely intertwined with what I would qualify as the divine than I ever did when I was trying desperately to reach for something outside of me and lose myself. So I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole just because what that person on TikTok said, which I can't even find their profile now, but what they said rang true to me in the moment, and I wanted to dig in and kind of learn why this feels true. And I found a speech that Liz Gilbert did, the author of Big Magic and Eat, Pray, Love. She did an absolutely incredible speech that I will link for y'all. I feel like I haven't been very good at linking things. Sorry about that, but I will have it linked. But she kind of quickly walks through a historical context for this that is really interesting to me. So she talks about Hammurabi's Code, which is the first set of like written laws that came about in ancient Babylon. And Hammurabi's Code is significant because this is where patriarchy was solidified. Basically, it wrote out the laws of
subjugation and abuse, women as property,
all of that. Let's be clear that patriarchy is not the natural way of things. It's not like the natural order that has existed since the beginning of time. There is a beginning of it. And I don't necessarily think that you can say that the Code of Hammurabi is like the beginning of patriarchy, but it is certainly the beginning of patriarchy as a world order, as law. But then the Axial Age comes along, and this is like 900 to 300 BCE, and you suddenly have a couple of very thoughtful, compassionate male leaders that come to the forefront. Here, you've got figures like Jesus and Confucius. They're preaching things like compassion and forgiveness and empathy, things that kind of got lost with the Code of Hammurabi. And this is revolutionary. The Code of Hammurabi is this doctrine that spreads around the world and is saying basically, strongest one wins, smash and subjugate everything else. So having men in the Axial Age have this realization that there are other people with other needs that they should actually take care of, and they should actually take care of the weak and the poor, was this revolutionary thing. But when you think about it, the women who were living under the oppression of the Code of Hammurabi were already doing that instinctually. So these men in the Axial Age had this idea of like,
if I can abandon myself and my ego, and I can actually take care of and think about other people, even the weakest of the tribe and the weakest outside of the tribe, that is a revolutionary idea, right? That's amazing.
I'm all for it. But Liz says, who do you think prior to the Axial Age was taking care of the sick and the weak and the poor, feeding the sick and the hungry, and taking care of babies at the beginning of their lives and old people at the end of their lives? Women. So these men that were these huge spiritual thought leaders came in and were basically telling men to act more like women. And this is a good thing that these teachings of compassion and forgiveness and empathy are being spread to men, because we've got these men who are operating under the Code of Hammurabi that just basically said, if you're strong, you win and smash everything else and take whatever else, it doesn't matter. So hearing something other than that is actually a great thing. We're all for it. But when you give that same spiritual advice to women and completely ignore the context that they're coming from, what you're essentially doing is telling them to double down on something that's already instinctual to begin with. And what happens when we do that is that we veer into the profane feminine. So while men, without these teachings of compassion and forgiveness, they veer into the profane masculine or toxic masculinity. But women can also veer into toxic femininity or the profane feminine when they're told to give the shirt off their back and lose all sense of self. And they go so deep into that. What this looks like is that in giving and giving and giving and getting rid of yourself and getting rid of yourself, you become a martyr or you become a victim. Because what happens when you tell somebody that is being abused to just show compassion and forgiveness to their abuser? The only thing that that can do is enable the abuse, right? Liz gives the example of going through a pretty brutal divorce with her ex-husband and how her ex-husband was like dragging her through the ringer, kind of trying to take everything that he possibly could, throwing insults at her, all of these things, making her life a living hell as best as he could for a long time. And for a long time, he was letting him, because the spiritual advice that she was getting was that of compassion and forgiveness. So she just thought, in order to get through this and in order to be my highest self in this situation, what I need to do is just be softer to him, be kinder to him, be more compassionate to him as he is pummeling me with this abuse. But what happens when you meet abuse with just compassion and forgiveness is that it enables the abuse and nothing changes. And what needs to happen to restore this imbalance is that we need to find a place of reciprocity. Women need to unlearn the constant self-betrayal that comes from giving from a place of empty. And that's just one example of how this could play out. I mean, I think of Claire and Fleabag. Not to go back to Fleabag, you know that I love to use that as a reference. If you watch the digital gardening episode, you might remember the decontextualized note that I wrote about how Claire is constantly betraying herself she's constantly choosing things that she doesn't actually want and kind of building a prison for herself out of other people's expectation of her in service to a man that is actually abusing her. And I want to make it clear that this can play out even when you're not like being abused, you know? I think that women are taught that the closest thing to godliness and like the most spiritual women out there are women that will sacrifice it all in service to other people. And there is something really beautiful about that idea, right? But when you really are sacrificing so much of what you in your core want and need out of life in order to pour into things that you don't necessarily even care about, or maybe you care about them, but you don't actually necessarily have control over them. Like this is where we see like a lot of control issues coming in. That builds up so much resentment in your relationships. There are so many different ways that this can play out. You've got the Liz Gilbert example of trying to be really kind and compassionate in the face of abuse, and that not getting you anywhere until you reach your breaking point and you finally put up a boundary. That is one way that this can play out. Another way that this can play out is the Claire from Fleabag way, where you are basically building up a prison for yourself of other people's expectations and not paying attention to your own desires in any way. And even to make myself an example, I have totally done this with my relationships with other people where I operate in a way that actually leads to self-betrayal. I have a pattern in romantic relationships where I catch myself worrying about the other person more than I am worrying about myself. And then I start to control this life that is outside of me. And that is a way that I'm trying to like lose myself. And I think that, you know, if I can help another person, then I'm a good person, right? If I can just help this other person, I'm a good person. If I can quote unquote fix this other person, then that makes me like spiritually better, right? But no, really what that leads to is controlling behavior, a disrespect of the other person's autonomy, and an abandonment of self, right? Because I'm losing out on so much of my own personal energy by giving it away and giving it away and giving it away and forgetting about myself. And in forgetting about myself, I think that I'm like becoming more spiritually good, right? Like the more that I lose myself, the more spiritually good I am. But that's not actually doing anybody in my community a service. It's doing them a disservice. So those are just three like quick examples of how this can play out. So two things that Liz Gilbert talks about that can help us start to unlearn this a little bit is one of them is to think of drawing a circle around yourself with yourself at the center of it and declaring that everything within this circle is sacred because you say so, with yourself at the center of it. And as you start to come across things that you feel are good and in alignment with your values and that you want to qualify as sacred to you, you bring those things into the circle. And it is your responsibility to safeguard and protect all that is within that circle. But you have to keep yourself in the center of that circle at all times. That's kind of just the concept of boundaries. But I think that the conversation around boundaries has kind of been warped in a way that has led to a lot of isolation. And Jamila Bradley actually has a Substack post called What the Self-Help Industry Has Wrong About Everything. They say, at their most misappropriated, the language of boundaries can be used as a means to control the actions and behaviors of others or coerce good behavior. If the advice around boundaries always leads to cutting people off, shutting down, or keeping everyone at arm's length, that's not healing. It's rugged self-preservation disguised as growth. Living life as a person with no boundaries, disappearing one's own dignity, integrity, and personhood is already a lonely way to live. It demands dishonest harmony over honest conflict and deep, meaningful connection, robbing the person themselves of the gift of arriving as their true self, and the people around them the opportunity of truly seeing and knowing them. It ferments resentment, self-betrayal, rage, and a sense of emotional enslavement. This makes it all the more important that boundaries exist as an amplifier of connection and belonging. Boundaries should serve to express our deep belief in loving connection by creating the conditions for it to exist and flourish. A boundary that isolates isn't a boundary, it's a wall. When boundaries are rooted in authenticity, they invite others to do the same, ultimately allowing us to give freely rather than out of obligation, which makes every interaction more genuine. There's also another piece of this article that I really want to highlight when it comes to boundaries, because I think while boundaries are so important, they're not spoken about very well, very often. But Jamila speaks about it so beautifully here. They say, when the advice leads to isolation, it creates a problem it can keep selling solutions for, which I think is often the way that boundaries are used, is a way of just saying, cut everybody in your life out of your life. I don't think that that's necessarily useful. I like to think of this circle of sacredness that you are drawing with yourself at the center of it as a way to invite more of that sacredness into your life and become protective of those things. Protective enough that you are okay with being labeled as an angry woman and, like standing up for yourself and for the things that you care about and believe in. I actually want to share something that I wrote earlier this week. I wrote a bit of a personal essay, and I'm not going to share the whole thing, but I think for me, when I'm thinking about placing myself in the center of this circle of sacredness, I actually think that that's something that I used to know how to do innately. I think when I was a child, I was really, really good at doing that. And I think over time, the world that we live in, I slowly forgot how to do that. And I actually think for me, this is going to be a process of unlearning a lot of things. And I know that that's not the case for everyone, but it is definitely the case for me. So I just want to read this little piece of this essay. Please be nice. It's not the best writing in the world, but whatever. It feels appropriate to share right now, so I'm going to share it. It says, I used to feel extra special because of a pile of white rocks on the front porch of my childhood home. I remember thinking we had the best house on the block because of this pile of rocks, not because it was beautiful, but because it was distinct, and anything distinct felt extraordinary to me then. When I look at pictures, it's clear to me now that it was just a garden bed without a garden. The rocks were a placeholder for two tired parents renting the house with no extra time or energy to give to a garden. From an adult's perspective, it's actually quite ugly. I look back on the girl that thought something so ugly made her so special, and I love her ardently. When strangers told her she had the best Halloween costume they'd seen all night, she believed them. When her music teacher went out of her way to ask her why she hadn't joined after-school choir yet, she took that to mean she had the most beautiful voice in the world. When her grandparents got her a cardboard cutout of Zac Efron for Christmas, she thought her entire family was full of comedic geniuses. When her first crush kept the sock doll she made him at the bottom of his backpack until the last day of school, it was assumed to be cherished, not forgotten. The pile of white rocks was special because they were hers. The compliments were special because they were assumed to be true. The gifts were special because they were given by people that were paying attention. The small embarrassments of infatuation didn't register as embarrassments at all because she imagined reciprocation was inevitable. She found details that made her feel special effortlessly. And she did this without trying every single day. She had an ego, and her attention was finely attuned to her own significance. Anything that violated the feeling that she was one of a kind garnered an intense reaction of indignation. Her family called her fire starter, not because she actually liked to start fires, but because she had a strong sense of justice towards herself. This wasn't always helpful. In fact, it was often problematic. But I guess the question is, when did I go from special as an assumed state of being to special as an endowment that I should act coy about, or special as a notification I need to keep refreshing the feed to find, or special as a state of being that a man has any power to take away? So yeah, I wrote this personal essay and didn't realize how connected it was to this topic until after I wrote it and reread it, and I was like, whoa, I guess I'm really thinking about this right now. Anyway, back to it. And then the other thing that Liz talks about as being helpful to all of this is learning to say, I don't care. I don't care about that thing. And me not caring about that thing doesn't actually make me a bad person. I don't have to pretend to care about things that I actually don't care about. And the more that I can say I don't care and I do care and become clear about those things, about what we do care about and what is going to take up our energy and what is not, is such an important thing to parse out for ourselves. Because in saying I don't care about the things that I don't care about, and I'm not actually going to be shamed into feeling like I should care about the things that I don't actually care about, that gives us more space to care about the things that we actually really do care about. And then we have to stand firm in the face of any judgment that we might get for caring about the things that we do care about and not caring about the things that we don't care about. I think of Bell Hooks' essay, Women Artists, The Creative Process, where she talks a lot about how women are very harshly judged for the amount of alone time that they need to spend in order to make the art that they need to make. And they're judged in a way that men just aren't. She says, we spend much time trying to figure out how to use our time wisely. We worry about not giving enough of our care and personhood to loved ones. Many of us still use labor with the underlying fear that if we care too much about art, we will end up companionless, alone. And some of us who have companions or children make sure that when we come home, there are no visible signs of our artistic selves present. And then she goes on to say, We are all impressed by men who devote their lives to artistic practice. I recall the wonder with which I first took the male German poet Rilke to be one of my artistic spiritual mentors and guides. His confessional writing made solitude seem like a necessary ritual for artistic self-actualization. No one seemed to find his devotion suspect. She says, I think often and deeply about women and work, about what it means to have the luxury of time spent collecting one's thoughts, time spent undisturbed. This time is space for contemplation and reverie. Work for women artists is never just the moment when we write or do other art. In the fullest sense, it is also the time spent in contemplation and preparation. And in talking about this amount of alone time that women need in order to create the art that they want to make, she says, our need for this uninterrupted, undisturbed space is often far more threatening to those who watch us enter it than is the space which is a moment of concrete production. We have yet to create a culture so utterly transformed by feminist practice that it would be common sense that the nurturance of brilliance or the creation of a sustained body of work fundamentally requires such undisturbed hours. So I don't know, that felt relevant to me in this conversation because I think when we look to whether it's spiritual mentors or artistic mentors that are men, they're just coming at it from a different context. And that doesn't mean that they can't give us anything of value, but it does mean that our experience in the world is going to be different. When people think about the amount of time that women devote towards themselves or their art, they do tend to look at women that devote a massive amount of time towards themselves and their art as being selfish. But it is up to you if you are putting yourself at the center of sacredness, how much time you are allowing to give to these things. And I think that the outside world can definitely put a lot of stuff in our ears about how selfish that might be. But I think if we want to come to a place of reciprocity in the world, we do need to reach a space where we are comfortable reclaiming our time and reclaiming our personhood and taking the time to self-express. Those things are a vital piece of our well-being. And I think if we're constantly told to lose ourselves and lose our egos, that can, for women, very quickly become a devotion to anyone but the self. And I personally just don't think that that sounds like it makes for a very beautiful life. I recently read a book called The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd, and it's about Anna, who is the fictional wife of Jesus, and she is a scribe. So she writes in a time when it was not legal for women to read and write, and it's a very feminist story. And I just want to read you the first couple of lines of this book that made me read this book without knowing really anything about it. It says, "All my life, longings lived inside me, rising up like nocturnes to wail and sing through the night. That my husband bent his heart to mine on our thin straw mat and listened was the kindness I most loved in him. What he heard was my life begging to be born." So all that to say, if you feel that longing of your life begging to be born, maybe start to evaluate how much of it you are sacrificing to other people. And anyway, I think that's all I have for you today. I feel like that was a lot. Please don't come evangelizing in my comments. I don't want it. I suddenly can't read if you're doing that. That's not what any of this is about. Anyway, love you so much. See you in 2 weeks.